started. Welcome everybody for what I think of as the newest season of the International Security Speaker Series here at the Strauss Center at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm Bobby Chesney. I'm a professor at UT and the director of the Strauss Center. Things are a little different this year for those of you who've been coming for a number of years. We still call it the International Security Speaker Series, but the way we put it together this year is integrated with the new Strauss Center program that we're very excited about. It's called the Brumley Next Generation Scholars Program. It has several components, but one part in particular that's relevant for us is the graduate program. In the spring of last year, we spread word around the campus that there would be a competition for fellowships for anyone in any graduate program at UT who was interested in any of the areas of research that the Strauss Center conducts. We had an incredible response from just about every department and program on campus. Approximately, was it 9 or 10? I don't remember. 10 selectees, one per research program, every one of them having beaten out a lot of competition to get that spot. It's a year-long project in which they'll be engaging in research under the mentorship of one of the faculty affiliates of the Strauss Center and meeting on a monthly basis to compare notes with one another about our research and a variety of other things. One feature of the program, though, that connects up to why we're all here today is that for each one of the fellows, their area of interest, we devoted one of the monthly ISS speaker slots to. So all the speakers this year all are connected from and come back to the interest of the folks in the program. In this case, it's LBJ School's own Jody Rosenstein, who is a PhD student here, and she will be introducing our guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chesney. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And if I could introduce myself again, I'm Jody Rosenstein. I'm a second-year PhD student here at LBJ, and I am the Next Generation Brumley Fellow for Special Operations Forces. On behalf of the Strauss Center, I'm truly honored to welcome Colonel Leon Collins, the Director of the Defense and Strategic Studies Program at West Point. Colonel Collins, it's truly an honor, and I can only hope that our muggy hot Austin weather doesn't make you miss the beautiful fall of the Hudson Valley. I'm from 10 minutes south, so I know exactly how wonderful that can be. But needless to say, Colonel Collins' contributions to national security are really too many to go into detail here. But I'll do my best to touch upon what has truly been an illustrious career so far and has straddled operational, tactical, and the academic. Colonel Collins is a career Special Forces officer. He served in various special operations assignments and conducted multiple combat operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as deployments in Bosnia, Africa, and South America. He's the recipient of numerous awards and decorations, including 2 glorious decorations. His academic achievements are no less impressive. While serving in his previous post as the director of the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, he co-authored the report, Letters from Abbottabad, Bin Laden Sideline. It was a study of 17 declassified documents that were captured during the Bin Laden raid. And in addition, he's honed the next generation of military minds by teaching courses in international terrorism, international conflict, international relations, and American politics. He holds a BS degree in aerospace engineering from the United States Military Academy and an MPA and a doctorate from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public International Affairs at Princeton. So suffice it to say, we are very lucky to have you today, and for all of us, this opportunity to benefit from his strategic and academic knowledge. So thank you, Colonel Collins.
All right, so what I'll talk about a little bit about is Special Operations Force and military innovation, really looking at the case study or looking at the evolution of the find, fix, exploit, analyze cycle, or what we call the F3EA cycle, and what we call the network. Basically, the network we created under General Crystal really from 2004 to 2006 that's still kind of operating today. So that's what I'll be going over. So kind of the outline right here, brief, gives you a definition of what I see innovation as and some of the various variables from organizational literature, what is military innovation in general, and then kind of get into the case study, get into the operational case itself, kind of describe what happened a little bit, how much of a transformation it was for the command, and then any questions you have after that. Right, so definitions, I mean, if you look at if you've studied innovation at all, you'll see that there really is no agreed upon definition out there. So after reviewing the literature, this is kind of what I came up with. Really, the adoption of a major change that's perceived as new to the organization. And really what I'm interested in here, like a lot of others, really the major changes, because they may be somehow fundamentally different from minor type of innovations, but really talking about broad changes. And specifically for the military, the changes relating to goals, tactics, strategies, and doctrine, or the structure of the organization. And to kind of distinguish that from adaptation or invention, really think of adaptation really as just kind of adjusting or modifying to the environmental conditions that you find. And invention really is, think of that as just bringing something new into being, and actually innovation kind of bringing something new into use. So kind of distinguish those. Right, if you look at kind of the organizational literature, you see these are just some of the major ones, but you'll end up with 30 plus different variables that all somehow influence innovation. And then the various studies, the quote on the bottom captures it pretty well. Factors found to be important for innovation in one study are found to be considerably less important, not important at all, or even inversely important in other studies. So not really going to run through all this because I know most of you don't really want to hear so much about innovation itself. But right, I mean, things like cost, right? Pretty easy to put your hands around. Something that costs more is probably more likely to be adopted, or something that costs more is going to be less likely to be adopted or pursued than something that costs less, right? All things being equal, right? So characteristics of the innovation influence it. The organization itself, right? Is it size? Some studies size, the bigger the organization, right? The harder it is to innovate. And others will say, no, it's easier to innovate because it's bigger, or maybe it's the complexity of the organization, or slack, right? So all these things affecting it. To, external, we'll get into some of those others, or external characteristics, right? It's something in the external environment that kind of forces the change within the organization. Specifically, what I was interested in looking at is leadership. I thought would be pretty important. So some kind of two opposing views, individualist and contextualist, right? Think of the individualist, right? They're basically just saying the leader does matter, or at least matters under certain circumstances. Contextualist, right? It's other factors in the environment that lead to innovation. The leader really isn't that critically important. If somebody else was in those shoes, they would do it. But if you kind of look at some of the theories on military innovation, very few of them really talk about the role of the leader in that innovation. Yet if you look at combat, right, what war have we studied ever where you don't know the names of famous generals or admirals, right, because of the factors, the effect they had on it. Right, so if they can have that effect in combat, why can't they have the same thing organizationally in terms of innovation? Next, right, creative work versus routine work. Innovation is creativity, right? So creative skills, and there's something fundamentally different with that kind of work from regular routine work. So the people that engage in innovation are fundamentally different. Not everybody is an innovator, as much as the military kind of uses that buzzword now. You can't just create everybody being an innovator. Right, so some of those, so it's fundamentally different in that regard. The tasks often novel, ill-defined. So some of the procedures that you have in place, the predefined structures may not work for influencing innovation. Also, right, so then you got to rely on different influence tactics kind of showed below to influence those people. And then last, right, a lot of times, right, there's an inherent conflict between innovation, right, or pursuing innovation, and in the organization itself, right? Because innovation's about risk, spending money, these kind of things. So there's that constant tension there. So kind of various studies show critical leader skills are technical expertise, right? You got to understand the subject. You can't just take somebody and put them into a different organization that they know nothing about and expect to have results. And creative problem-solving skills. And then last kind of listed down there are some of the influence tactics that leaders must do to be effective, right? You can't just stick the innovators in a corner and expect them to be successful. Yeah, that happens occasionally, but really we'll find out more often than right. You got to provide stimulation, encourage involvement, right, to fundamentally from project selection, right? What you decide to, where you put your effort right there is making a choice from the onset. And then the culture they create within the organization. Right, so if you look at the military innovation literature, right, there's 6, predominant models, right? Civil military model, right? This one you probably heard before, right? Military's resistant to innovate, and so it takes the outside, the civilian policymaker, often through the military maverick, to force innovation, right? Or inter-service model, right? This has to do with more resource scarcity, right? The services are fighting for their fair share of the budget, so that's what's going to cause them to innovate in order to kind of keep that budget share. So some authors like looking at the Polaris missile development, kind of the nuclear triad, right? Or intra-service, right? It's within the service itself, right? So kind of like the inter-service. The service is fighting. This is branches within a service fighting for, their piece of the pie, right? Maybe there's some new tech, like think of like, right, cyber security or something, right? Maybe one branch in the Army, then branches will be fighting over that, or the services, right, the inter-service model. They're fighting for a bigger chunk because that's one of the few growth industries within the military, so they're all going to try to take ownership of that to try to grow their budget. Cultural model, right? So it's a nation's reaction to new technology, right? It's this strategic opportunity shaped by the culture of the organization itself and the way it goes from there. In principal agent, really not talking so much about how the innovation itself is brought about, but really how it's executed once it's adopted, right? So, and then finally, kind of bottom up. This is kind of different. The rest are kind of a little different, but this is, from going back to Stormtroop Tactics from Luther Gunderson on that. But one thing they kind of all agree on is that fundamentally, innovation in war is fundamentally different process than innovation in peace, right? So it's a different kind of environment. And then also kind of looking at this list, what you see is like these are kind of the dominant schools of thought, and it's really divergent from what the other lists I just kind of put up there. It doesn't mention a lot of the same things that all these other schools on innovation or studies on innovation have learned over the years. So it kind of diverged over the years, so kind of seeing, okay, trying to look at them all together and what does it give you? So really kind of you're left with, innovation process, right? So kind of 4 distinct phases. Some people have 3, some people have 5, but really, you can break them up how you want, but really 4 in there, right? So formulation, right? You're going to accumulate knowledge, right? You're getting a read on the environment out there in some way that identifies some kind of performance gap, right? Typically results from, right, a change in the environment, a change in the enemy, or maybe a technological change that's forcing that change, giving some kind of capability gap. And then the generation of the idea itself, right? So you can see in this case, a senior military leader, right, can really influence that last one, right? The generation of the idea by those influence tactics that we showed before. Next, during the acceptance phase, right, this is okay if it's kind of coming up from the bottom, right? Somebody, the innovator or the innovator who is promoting that innovation is going to select a strategy on how they're going to get this adopted, knowing that they're going to meet resistance in their organization. Then some kind of coalition building, right? You got to build your coalition horizontally and vertically to get to that decision maker, to get them to adopt the innovation. So one thing I always joked about when I was trying to get some people deployed overseas to whatever country, and I always said it took like 100 yeses to get anybody to go anywhere, but it only took 1 no. Because if somebody gave you no, then you were done, right? Whatever organization. So you got to get to the decision maker, and that's part of the building that. Then implementation, right? This is the kind of the principal agent problem again. Enforcement strategy kind of leaves with 4 possible outcomes, right? You got your martyrs that are going to try to sabotage. You got your zealots, vigilant transformation, and then you got the in between, right? Those that are going to hedge and foot drag. And diffusion, not going to cover so much, but right, think of that, right? 2 ways to think of diffusion, right? 2 other similar organizations, or really is it enduring over time, right? So a leader can make a change, but if it doesn't endure past the time they leave, it's typically only going to be there 2 or 3 years, then what good is that? Is it really innovation if it doesn't endure? So looking at kind of diffusion over time and space. And we'll get back to these a little bit later. All right, so getting into probably what you guys really want to hear about. So what we developed really was a find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze cycle. So I'll explain the cycle and then how we got there, right? So find, when we're talking find, that's, right, think of the enemy that we're facing kind of in the contemporary environment. What we have is the identification problem now. Not everybody's wearing uniforms, marching out on the battlefield, so the problem is, how do you find this enemy from a non-combatant or someone else out there? Same thing like police work or anything else. How do you find this amongst all the chatter out there to figure out who the individuals are that you're even pursuing? Next, fixing them. So fix is really thinking of, right, establishing a pattern of life, getting enough intelligence on someone so that you can execute an operation with reasonable certainty that they're going to be there. Right? That doesn't mean, ideally, right, you have a pattern of life established, you have a, we call the unblinking eye, right? You've got eyes on them 24 hours a day and you know where they're at. Or think like the Bin Laden raid, right? Hey, it was just at a certain level, but it was good enough to have reasonable probability that they would be there. Finish, think of that as, right, kill or capture, but it could be other things that you could do as well. And then exploit, analyze, right? Exploit is right after you capture them. either immediate interrogating them on target, right, collecting any of their electronic media, pocket litter, those kind of things, and then analyzing it, right, bringing that data back for someone else to actually analyze in greater depth. And then the cycle just keeps on going, right? So as you've identified someone, you put the resources out there on them to fix them, right? Then you go capture them, you pull their electronic media or something off, give it to someone, they analyze it, and it gives you all new targets, right? So that's kind of what the cycle was that we created. But at the time, in kind of 2003, it was kind of a shell of this. Really what it was a find, fix, finish cycle, and then the process would have to start all over again. Because we just didn't have really any exploit or analyze capability to what we have in the present day. So when General McChrystal took command in October of 2003, that's kind of what he came in on. It was a find, fix, finish cycle, and going from there. Where did this terminology came about? From one of his subordinate commanders had read Tranquille on modern warfare, a French view of counterinsurgency, right? So he's reading what the French did back in Algiers. So not only did he read this, became clear to him, hey, we're really losing on this exploit phase, kind of relearning what the French did 50 years ago. We should have already known this, but we're relearning it. And then him being smart, he figured, hey, I've got to turn this into some kind of an acronym or some kind of a thing. In order to write, you got to communicate the new idea. Otherwise, people won't understand it. So how do you communicate it effectively? And so that's what he came up with and put it on a slide in 2004. And then McChrystal, he really liked that. He said it kind of captured what we called the blink problem, right? Anything that kind of slowed or delayed the targeting process, we call that, a blink. So you kind of would lose your momentum. And in this case, between at least half a dozen organizations, often separated by geographical distances, time zones, or cultural barriers, physical distances, would contribute to that problem. And so by the time they would get to the finish phase and get here again, they'd exploit this. By the time they could exploit whatever was on it, it was the intelligence is fleeting, and they would have to start all over again, fixing them instead of if they could have expedited the cycle. So part of this problem was technological. I'd say that's probably the lesser part of the problem. Really more of it was due to cultural and lack of trust, right? So everybody at all the level, primarily on the intel sharing side, right? The question always asked, should we pass this intelligence? If so, how much? If we share it, do we lose control over it? Will I get into trouble if I share this intelligence? And will those we pass it to use it in the way that was agreed upon? So ultimately, that's kind of what General McChrystal's idea, the vision for it was, right? A network was needed to operationalize this cycle, in order to be effective. So in October of 2003, he took over the command, visited all his elements overseas, and what he came back with, right? These were kind of the significant shortfalls that he identified, right? We had no common strategy. What it really was, the command really wasn't being an effective headquarters element. It was a bunch of separate entities fighting in different locations, not really tied to one another. And a lot of times, right, you're fighting a network that's all tied to one another. Wasn't really good sharing going on on our side of what was out there. In terms of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, ISR, at that time we had, in October 2003, basically like a single predator. Human intelligence, that was actually our strongest thing, and it was pretty weak at the time. Interrogators, I think we had a total of 13 over there at the time, and we'll talk about that a little more on the next one. And document exploitation, that took maybe like 28 days to send something back and actually get some kind of feedback off it. If you were lucky, it might be 28 days to get that. And so really this would look like is you would get some kind of intelligence, right? Probably just single source human intelligence that wasn't very good or corroborated. Then you would go to the target, get whoever they said, and you would bring them back. And then you would take them to and take any kind of media off the target. You put them in there. So we'd have we'd have a bag, sandbags or something. We'd put all the media in there, take it to a storeroom, and then there it would just sit. So right when General McChrystal took over, and we all recognized it was a problem, there'd just be a room just piled up with electronic media. In terms of triaging this There was no triage. It was just kind of first in was the one that got processed. And in terms of like interrogations, I would give them the person that I was supposed to get, and then I would ask them, a week or two later, I'm like, well, can I have any kind of interrogation report on this? What did you find out? And now we get nothing. Either they didn't, or they wouldn't even know what questions to ask them because they just didn't have the number, or they didn't even know what to ask this person, how he was tied with the intel. And so we lost this whole portion here. We couldn't exploit it for follow-on because they didn't even know what questions to ask, and to go from there. So really, that was kind of October of 2003. So we had some experience up until that point, kind of developing, kind of getting into this cycle. Some time in Afghanistan after 2001, and then early on in Iraq in 2003, right, looking for the former regime leadership. So some time kind of doing those operations, and so we had done that. And then kind of in December, that's when we kind of shifted full, after capturing Saddam, then moved over towards focusing almost exclusively on Zarqawi and Al Qaeda in Iraq. So really, the next was building the network itself. Again, this started with kind of General McChrystal's vision of it takes a network to defeat a network, and then we had developed the F3EA cycle in concept. Now we just had to execute it in practice, but we had kind of a vision. We knew where we were trying to go with it, and so how could we do this? And really, every time you'd identify some shortfall and you'd fix that shortfall, then that would expose a hole in another part of what you were trying to do. So in this case, these are kind of like the major things that we did, right? So the first thing you did was flatten the network. Again, as he said, it takes a network to defeat a network, right? Due to fleeting intelligence that we were operating on, everybody had to be on the same kind of common operating picture. Everybody had to understand what was going on. You couldn't be a hierarchical organization and go through 3 levels of command to try to get permission to go execute a raid. You had to understand that you had the authority to do that, and you had to be empowered to do that. Other information sharings, and you get back in 2003, so I know for the younger ones in here this might be obvious or whatever, but right, a portal where we could all have information that we could all share, access to the same thing, right? Establish email protocols so that everybody could get everything they needed without crippling them, right? That's the challenge. How do you do that? How do you get info so everybody's on there but without crippling people? And then video teleconferences that I'll talk about. All right, next was kind of establishing liaison networks. So in 2004, probably around March or April of 2004, the first Battle of Fallujah, right? Going in and making progress, and then kind of the administration halted progress and told the Marines to stop with the operations in Fallujah. So that caught the command totally off guard, primarily talking about Task Force 714. Caught them totally off guard, and he didn't want to be surprised again, and so we already had a handful of kind of liaison officers at this time, but really kind of pushing those out. So, by 2006, probably several dozen, at least probably 30 different liaison officers at various locations, some DoD, other units, other interagency partners that we were partnered with and needed to be part of this. So pushing them out there. And the key was pushing people out there that you need, right? You couldn't just put somebody you didn't want out there to be your L&O, because then they couldn't do a job of what you need as a liaison. You got to put somebody out there that it hurts to give up. Otherwise, they don't do any good for you, right? And empowering them to speak on behalf. And the other thing that we did with typically when we kick them out there, it'd be like kind of like a 50-50 rotation. Like if it was ambassadors and stuff or others, they wanted to have somebody all the time, but then the downside of that is they kind of own them, right? And then they go native and don't really follow the interests of what you're looking for anymore. And if you send them out there for 3 or 6 months at a time and bring them back, well, they're working like crazy when they're out there as well. So those are things we did. Standing the video teleconference capability. So this is the thing, like he's, again, probably more normal now, but at that time it was fairly new, right? So establishing these getting them up at every location, no matter how far forward you were, right? And this would meet some resistance at first. Like me as a commander, why do I want, I don't want him, have this communication with me and he expects me to listen to it. But then really by seeing that it's valuable and you're getting something out of it, it would work. And this really, what he described as the single most effective, what he said, single most effective tool I had at my disposal in leading a dispersed force. So 9 hours a week, typically 6 days a week. So we're going in on Saturdays, or a lot of our interagency partners are going in Saturday morning to attend the VTC. But for an hour and a half every morning, starting at like 9 a.m. on the Eastern time, and basically just kind of giving an update of what's going on. He said that it was important to him to influence, inspire, and learn through this, right? It was a way for him to communicate information and really get everybody on the same sheet of music. So you always knew what the commander wanted, no matter which level you were at. You could hear that. And by so in 2003 or 2004, just a handful of stations, and by 2007, thousands of people attending from 72 distinct locations, right? Many of them within DC, but so we had that. Building the first joint interagency task force, right? So this came at the suggestion of your own Bill McRaven when he was the deputy. Right, so kind of following the success that we had during the, establishing some GIADFs in 1994 for the counter-drug missions, right? But kind of anybody that's been any part of organization, right? It's so much easier to cooperate at the lower level or when you're co-located, when you have a common mission focus. So that was really the idea: bring everybody together, put them in the same room, and have them provide that mission focus. So we would do that, bring them overseas, right? If they're overseas again versus being at home. If you're at home doing it in DC, right, you're distracted by soccer games and everything else. Forward, you have nothing else to do but focus on the fight. So we would have our intel analysts would bring our partners right out there and see people loading up on the helicopters to do operations, right? So they could see the immediacy of their work, right? They weren't just, if they were at home, writing a report that they didn't know if anybody ever read it. Here, I remember one analyst saying, I don't know if anybody's ever reading my reports because I don't get any feedback, but every time I write a report on a guy, the next night, this guy is going into the interrogation facility. So it must be working. And so that really drives them, and then they're motivated to really make it work. Improving interrogation capability. Again, like in 2003, like I said, we had nothing. So a lot of times we would just do it ourselves, and we weren't necessarily well trained. One time I was really happy because they gave me a strategic debriefer to do my stuff for me, and I was like, all right, we finally got somebody who's qualified. I was like, this guy is terrible. And then I was asking about something. I'm like, do you even know what Stockholm Syndrome is? And he's like, no. And I'm like, you're going to get training. You're done here. Right, but that's kind of how we started. But we grew from like 13 to well over 100, right? And it was partnering, so you'd have the analysts partnered with the interrogator, and then eventually, right, getting to the operator who's going in on the target, right? So it was, like I said, a cultural shift. It's not just, hey, they're not just going on the target now, but we figured out, hey, how can we get better at this? So I would take my guys, if they captured someone, we would take them and they go back with the interrogator. So then they could tell the interrogator, say, here's where he was, here's what he was doing, So then previously, right, if they didn't have that information, they could just lie, and the interrogator has no idea what's going on. But and then our guys would get better. They would know what to look for on target because they're like, okay, this is what the interrogator's questions are asking. This is how they can get information out of them. This is how I can be more effective on the target to help them get that information. So those kind of things that we did over time. Resourcing was the hardest part often, right? How to get the right linguists. So it was really kind of beg, borrowing, and stealing from everybody that we could think of to get it, to get the right people. And then part of it, again, was proven that it was capable. Because at first, right, they built a new, state-of-the-art facility to do this in. But those that had better success with having their own interrogators forward didn't want to give people up because they didn't trust, right, the headquarters. Because up until this time, the headquarters had given nothing, right? Because I used to give you something and you'd never give me anything back. So why am I going to give you anybody? So that was kind of. But once they saw that the headquarters were being successful, well, then we couldn't bring them there fast enough, right? Then they had the opposite problem. They'd be like, hey, when are you going to pick these guys up? We need you to start work on them. And so it would just kind of feed off itself. All right, in terms of expanding ISR capability, like I said, again, okay, everybody focuses on the technological piece of it. Yeah, a lot of it was technological, but it really was a cultural change as well, right? So our operators would sit right down there with the people running the drones, right? And so that are running the unmanned aircraft, right? So then the people controlling the aircraft would get better understanding what we're looking for, and then ours would get better understanding of how those things operate and how it could be effective. So doing that, and so the same kind of thing. Eventually that grew to dozens of things, but again, it was going out and just getting what we needed. In some cases, we weren't getting the support that we needed, so We had SOCOM buy us a bunch of aircraft, and we just gutted the things out and then put in the equipment that we needed to create what we called the Confederate, or what somebody called the Confederate Air Force, because we just flew whatever we could to operate over there. In some cases, right, developing new signal intelligence capability, right? And that was people not, back at NSA developing it for us, but people on the ground developing it, being smart enough to kind of figure out how to operationalize these capabilities and be effective. Expanding documentation, document exploitation, right? So same kind of things. So in the summer of 2004, somebody caught we just missed Zarqawi for probably like the third time. And we're like, okay, we got the hard drive. At that time, we had no other way. We had to physically bring it back to the U.S. So we had somebody, it took them about 2 days to get back to the U.S., gets it back there. We give it to everybody, and 24 hours later, we're going to have a video teleconference so we can see what's on this computer so we can exploit it. So 24 hours later, we have it. NSA's like, yep, we've exploited it. And we're like, all right, what do you got? And they're like, well, we just exploited it. All we did was take the info, and we just download it. Someone else has to analyze it. We're like, oh, we're not even speaking the same language. When the CIA, we're like, okay, what do you, they're like, all right, we've exploited it. We're like, what do you got? And they're like, well, we can't share it with you. We're like, we're the ones that captured it. And then we got to, and then the last person that gets up that we hadn't even heard of was National Media Exploitation Center, NMIC. And they provided, hey, this is where we're at right now, a summary of what they already had and kind of what they were kind of thought was in there. And we're like, holy crap, this is awesome. Right, so eventually what we got is we got more and more communication equipment. Then we don't need a large team forward, right? Just establish big communication satellite architecture, and you can just shoot all that information back to the rear to be processed. But MNIC, I guess, previously kind of was known as a toilet bowl because they never produced anything. You would give them all the stuff, and nothing ever came out. Well, they didn't give us anything. They never gave anything of value because no one ever gave them anything of value, right? They would just kind of give them stuff. So now you could triage what we were giving them by having a small element forward that could do that. And then finally, the GIADF. So we built a second GIADF starting in December of 2004. So at this time, for those of you that remember, right, a lot of the suicide bombers in Iraq, right, or in this case, foreign fighters going to Iraq were only about 150 to 200 a month is what we were estimating. And if you're talking total number of surgeons in the country, 12,000 to 20,000. So why do we care so much about 150 to 200? Well, those were the ones, almost every suicide bomber was a foreigner, right? And so they were having a strategic effect. So we were trying to figure out how to stop this foreign fighter facilitation network. So what we created was write a second GIADF to do this, kind of like the first, but this was much more, tactically and operationally focused. And so the same kind of effectiveness on this, and it was extremely effective, but the challenge then on this is how do you resource it, right? Because there's only so many good people or so many people that want to go overseas from these various organizations where you're asking purely for volunteers to go do this. And they just run out of capability. But, using like the video teleconferences again to kind of reinforce, getting various agencies having their analysts get up there and talk. Anytime General McChrystal had a chance, he'd thank their agency for the support they were providing. We were letting them know that they were part of the team and critical players. And so really kind of what this left then is, right, so all these things are different pieces of it, right? So the ISR capability, that's more on the fixed piece of what we were doing. Document exploitation, right, clearly on the exploit and analyze piece. So all these, right, same thing, building the interrogation capability, right, the exploit analyze piece. So really kind of focusing on that. So what it became was, what used to be kind of finished was our main effort, kind of coming out of the 90s, in the late 90s, if you look, read some of the stuff in various articles and stuff, kind of coming out of the PIFWIC missions in Bosnia, personal indicted for war crime, kind of looking for people and doing that. So it kind of morphed over time to something that was kind of this cycle. So in April of 2004, we could do about 10 targets in a month. And then by April of 2006, we were doing 300. And in terms of the operational force on the ground, hadn't changed. What really changed was going back. Go back. Right. What really changed here was this, making this the main effort, and understanding. Right. We were just getting people really to get this, to get more of this. Right. So then the cycle would just speed up. So instead of taking 3 or 4 days to work your way through the cycle, you could go on a target and you could do 4 or 5 targets in the same period of darkness, because you would go out there, hit the target. immediately exploit certain capabilities, and that would immediately lead to new targets that you could just go and prosecute during that same period of darkness. And let's see. All right, so I'm not going to go into every one of these. Make sure you guys get some time for questions. All right, so kind of the role of leadership, where do ideas for innovation come from? In this case, in terms of military innovation, the idea itself develops from a capability gap every time. In this case, it was the Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Zarqawi and his network. Or it was the IEDs in terms of counterinsurgency doctrine or other things, right? But coming out of some kind of capability gap. Okay, why do multiple individuals or organizations that identify the same gap, why do different resolutions result, right? Why do some people just adapt, some people innovate, and some will just, keep, charging up the hill, right, without making any change? Right, in terms of organizations, that's probably a little easier to explain. A lot of times it's probably kind of goes back to the saying, where you stand depends on where you sit, right? So it made sense for this kind of innovation to come from Task Force 714 because that was kind of their mission set, and they had experience kind of doing it to this point. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was kind of theirs. But in terms of why do different individuals, some present with the same problem, why do some innovate and some don't? I think kind of goes back to some of the earlier stuff, but I think it's really the technical expertise and the problem solving. So in this case, technical expertise you can think about as a combination of experience and education. Because a lot of times, at least in the military, right, you aren't going to get that real life experience oftentimes. So you've got to learn it from other ways until you get out there, because learning takes time, right? So if you're in there and you're trying to learn what counterinsurgency is while you're in the fight, then that might take 2 or 3 years, and you can't wait that long because that's a lot of money and lives that are going to be lost. All right, so what's the role of the senior military leader in facilitating the development of innovative ideas? Kind of supported what kind of found from the literature. And I think, again, General McChrystal has another great quote from his book that kind of sums it up. He says, more than once I encountered equipment we'd purchased or tactics we'd adopted and made me worry I was negligent in oversight. But I thought of the alternative. Of course it did centralization, and that squelched my inclination to grab control. Right, so he recognized that he had to let them develop it. So kind of what we find from this is, McChrystal, or we find the same thing with Petraeus for counterinsurgency doctrine, or General Cody for establishing the IED task force or asymmetric warfare group. They provided the vision, but it's really the subordinates that are executing it, right? So even if the leader's developing the innovative idea, the subordinates are the ones executing it. And he really only gave the vision. A lot of these innovations were all developed by subordinates, right? But clearly selecting the right project, making it a clear priority, balancing that oversight, culture. The organization, the SOF organization he was in charge of, very established culture that supported innovation. I could think of times we go out there and somebody put on a demonstration. Maybe they're demonstrating some kind of new charge or some kind of new tactic. Everybody go out there and look at it, and they put it on. It would just fail miserably. And so everybody just make fun of them for the first minute, and then the next, right, as soon as that's done, then you're like, oh, everybody's like, here's how you could do it better. Maybe this would work, or maybe that would work, right? So it was just kind of how they all fed off each other. By contrast, not so much on this, but other cases like, why was it Petraeus that really kind of pushed the counterinsurgency doctrine, not his predecessor? Well, his predecessor, General Wallace, did actually create some counterinsurgency doctrine, but he basically had no knowledge of he lacked the understanding of it. He didn't have the technical expertise, so he didn't resource the people that were doing it. He couldn't really provide accurate or good feedback and advise them, so it kind of just stalled. All right, so we'll go a couple more questions. All right, what's the role of the senior military leader in adoption? Right, so clearly, why do a senior military leader? What I'm talking about really is like a 3 or a 4-star general, someone that's in the position to really adopt an innovation. Right, if you think maybe somewhere else, it's hard. Try to think of, but like in an organization, right? So any major organization, any major innovation is going to take some kind of change in organization, doctrine, or some kind of capability. All those things require somebody's deliberate decision to change, right? The change is not going to happen without them knowing, right? Doctrinal change has to have their permission, right? We got to write new doctrine, right? So it's going to take it's not just going to happen. So they have to actually approve it. Okay, so that's obvious, but what else is their role? What you primarily saw in this, didn't get it so much here, but really their influence is more external to the organization, right? The network worked because it was a larger interagency network. If it would have just been Department of Defense, it never would have worked, right? But he spent all his time really building that. What's the role of civilian policymakers in adoption? In this case, it was pretty much minimal, and all the things I looked at, other case studies I looked at during the war, pretty much what they were is steadfast supporters. They were, whatever the military wanted in terms of the innovation, they were really supportive of it, right? And they would find the resources, find the money to do it. Think of like the MRAP, right? They found billions of dollars for that. They weren't really the ones pushing the military to do this stuff most of the time. All right, last, obstacles. What obstacles do leaders face when attempting to implement innovation? And how can these obstacles be overcome? Right, this goes back to the principal agent problem. Right, so internal and external. Right, internal to the organization, you're always going to have yours that don't want the innovation for any number of reasons or don't understand it. And then external, right? So in this case, right, a lot of the interagency partners that we really needed to support us. Right, so part of it is selecting and empowering the right trusted agents, right? Bringing the right people into your organization and putting them in the right positions to make the innovations happen. So he would do that, or he'd push those L&Os, right? Put the liaison officers out to all those networks, right, to kind of keep them and pull them along. Making innovation a clear priority, right? Communicating that at the VTCs. Getting unfiltered assessments, right? Anybody that's been in a leadership position knows sometimes how hard it is to actually get the truth of what's going on the ground. So figuring out ways to do that, right? So what the techniques that he would use and General Petraeus and General Cody would do, the video teleconference, right? Get that information. Frequent battlefield circulation. I know every time he would come, the first time he came and visited me in Iraq, I picked him up and stuck him in the back of this local vehicle that was had no armor on it at all, but at least the locals didn't know who I was, so I felt a lot safer than if I had been in a thickly armored vehicle. But we brought him back, and all he did was ask questions of my guys for like an hour straight. I'm like, you didn't give me anything. All you did was take for an hour. So when I drive back to the airport, I'm going to start asking him questions, right? But that was his way of getting information, right, without having his staff filter it. Or in his case, right, with the interagency partners, right, trying to pull them along. What was critical for him, I asked him one time, I'm like, why are you in Iraq the whole time? You can command and control this stuff from anywhere in the world. I need you in Washington to get all our interagency partners on board and keep their support. And he's like, well, I have no credibility with them unless I'm deployed. So he would spend 10 months a year just for the credibility, not because he needed to be out there to command it. But that was where he could have the credibility with the interagency because they would see him deployed for 10 months. But he would make frequent visits there to let them know, hey, how critical they were to the larger effort. And then, the chief of staff, he had this saying, you're either a martyr or a zealot, right? So he kind of made it clear in in implementation, right? You're either part of the team or you're not part of the team. There is no in between. And then real quick, so these kind of four things come out of General Petraeus kind of lists these as 4 critical tasks of strategic leadership in implementing organizational change. And I think in the case of counterinsurgency doctrine, he did these. In the case of General McChrystal and kind of getting the network built, did this, right? Getting the big ideas right, kind of figuring out we got to build this network to defeat the network. That was his vision, but he didn't know what that looked like at the time. It just kind of built, and as you built, you just kind of built it as you were going, right? And then communicating it effectively, right? Kind of the VTCs, other methods, ensuring their implementation. Like I said, you're either a zealot or a martyr, and then institutionalizing them over time. So that's about it for this. That way we got time for questions.
Well, I know there will be a lot of questions, and some of the students would like to launch us into those questions. That would be terrific. Not everybody all at once, though.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'll let you go first. You get the privilege.
Quick question. You describe an organization that is extremely flat. And I'm wondering, especially since that was at the beginning of really our operations we spoke mostly of Iraq, but what about once Big Army entered and even more soft deployed, was it able to remain a flat organization?
Yeah, it's still flat. Okay, I mean, some things they get harder over time, right? So the closer we were to 9/11, then you made things happen. Then over time, right? More of the inter-agency partners wanted to, do formal memorandums of agreement and these kind of things. It sometimes made things harder, but we understood why they were doing it. It wasn't because, again, they weren't supporting the effort, but they have just, right, when we look at it, I mean, think of for the Department of Defense, our oversight is actually pretty good, right, in terms of House Armed Services Committee, Senate Armed Services Committee. I mean, they really like Defense Department for the most part. They're usually not hammering them, where the Intel oversight committees are just crushing the people that they're providing oversight for. And so it was more for that. So we would have problems with that, or with State Department trying to get agreements on things that became harder over time. But in terms of us, it worked pretty well. And then other things worked better over time. I mean, I can think the first time I was trying to put some capabilities into a certain country, and I was what is that, Langley? The first thing I asked, I asked our liaison officer who was there, I'm like, do you know anything about this guy? And he's like, I don't know who he is. So the first thing I try to figure out is like, have he ever worked with me before? So have you ever worked in Iraq? And he's like, yeah, I worked in Iraq in 2003. I'm like, well, where are you at? And he's like, I was in Al Qaim. I'm like, oh, you're in Al Qaim? I'm like, do you know Jet and Taz? He's like, oh yeah, those guys are great. I need to write them a letter right now. And then right there, I knew we were good because of the relationships we had kind of built over time. So a lot of it, yeah, I mean, but a lot of it, this worked on reputation too. So part of it was, I mean, I was aware of what was going on around the world too. I mean, I was coming back from hitting like 5 different embassies on a briefing trip, and was in, where was I in? Flying through somewhere in the Middle East, Kuwait, I think, and I was at the hotel, and outside was an English newspaper, and I look it up, and I'm reading about 2 guys at like 3 a.m. shooting somebody in Paraguay in self-defense, and I'm like, oh God, I'm going to have to, totally other part of the world, I'm going to have to pay for this now, because I got to tell them, no, that's not our people, that's somebody totally different, but for them, it's all the same. Yeah. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for the talk. Thanks for being on the Zoom speaking with us. So I'm particularly intrigued by the applicability of what you mentioned as the FPDA cycle to cyberterrorism, because what's particularly unique about that is that some of the initial steps, like even attribution or finding, are fuzzy, if not difficult. And what I'm wondering is, do you see any fundamentally different approaches that are applicable to that area, or much of what you mentioned essentially applies to that area?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cycle still applies. I mean, what we had, our advantage, right, in this world is this was already well developed. I think in cyber, we don't even have this well developed. So we don't know, we aren't even sure what finished looks like or what our authorities are in terms of that. Even if we have a capability, then the authorities are always murky. It was pretty clear. We knew what it was finished in any given country, right? Easier in the countries like Iraq or Afghanistan, but anywhere else, we knew what our authorities were at all time. But in cyber, I think that's the challenge. But then, yeah, when we're lacking everywhere on it. But the same process would work. Yeah.
Excellent presentation, Ralph. I'm wondering if you could extend this analysis of yours off towards more the peacetime army, because peacetime is one of the real significant changes you made to the next war. And how difficult is it going to be to bring in a major change like this during a peacetime situation?
I mean, I haven't looked that closely at the peacetime innovation. I mean, like I said, I mean, a lot of people think it's fundamentally different. It is for a lot of reasons. And part of why I care so much about wartime innovation is no matter what we think the next conflict will be like, we will always be wrong, and we will always have to innovate when we get there. So we've got to understand what allows us to innovate, so that when we got there, right, we've got leaders that can innovate, right? So if it's intellectual capital, which I think is a good chunk of it, well, then we need to invest in intellectual capital more than we need to invest in equipment, special equipment, because when we get there, the equipment may not be of any use to us, but if we got smart people that are problem solvers, they'll figure it out. So, I mean, some of the stuff I bring up will be the same in terms of leader influence, but some of it's going to be a little different. Yeah.
Could you speak about the F3EA cycle in areas where we have counterterrorism missions but don't necessarily have tactical operators on the ground? So, for instance, like Syria, Iraq,
Right, it's all the same though, right? It's the same process. It just, right, ideally this is not a US finishing, right? As long as somebody's finishing, we don't care. The best is it's somebody else, right? So we may just be providing certain capability, right? Maybe a host nation lacks, right, somewhere, okay, Pakistan lacks the will to go after bin Laden. We're going to execute the finish, right? We're going to do it in that case. But, right, maybe some other nation, they lacks a certain capability to do the fix, right? Maybe some kind of signal intelligence capability. Okay, maybe we're not going to give them the capability because there's reasons we wouldn't want to do that. But we give them the intelligence that allows them to finish it. And so a lot of times, yeah, the best case is we don't want to do it. Yeah.
Check on that? So acting by witness through locals is often very advantageous. What about on the back end? So that they go in with our intel and they finish. Do you guys, is there any well-developed process of trying to train them up on the technical aspects of exploitation of the sites and the individuals and equipment, or is that a concern?
Yeah, no, it's the same, right? Like I said, this is our main effort. So there's training from various within our government. I mean, we want them to be capable of doing all of it. So yeah, there's training involved on these pieces, and a lot of times, right? Like we found out a lot of times, I mean, we could set up video teleconference capability even to help with interrogations if we couldn't physically fly someone there. But if it's their nation's citizen, a lot of times they know things that they can leverage better than we ever could. So a lot of times they're going to be better at this stuff. But we have the intel that goes on the back side of it, so it's everybody using their strength to kind of get what you need out of it so you can exploit effectively. But if you're not using the host nation, right, to somebody that has that expertise or might know something about their family member, right, then we're missing that. So it was really building that. It wasn't just trying to be focused on the U.S. here, but it wasn't just interagency was where the biggest partnerships were, but it was also with the other nations as well. And we did have a large network for that. Yeah.
I just wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about what you mean by the bottom-up process in the first step of innovation, so the formulation. So is the key point that the top leadership can get good, unfiltered information from the men and women basically on the ground, or?
Now that was more of like, okay, going into it is you would think that the closer you are to the fight, that's where a lot of innovations are going to develop. But at the same time, the people that are closest to the fight are often the lowest, right? They have less experience and less knowledge, less years in the organization. So if you think of back with the IEDs, right? Well, forward to the front, they're throwing sandbags, they're throwing armor on the vehicles because that's all they have. But then somebody that's higher up in the organization, right, is going to come up with other solutions that someone never could. Like General Cody, who was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, he's thinking, I can create a whole new organization that can go after the networks. That's right. It's a human problem. This isn't a technological problem, right? It's not like we know we can't stop bullets or artillery. Why do we think we can stop an IED? Impossible, right? It's just you never can. You can do things to mitigate some of them, but so the same thing on that, where a private's not going to think, hey, I can create a whole new organization. So part of it's like at the level of the other thing, but a lot of the bigger innovations really weren't bottom up. A lot of them were kind of top up, or the bottom's doing it, coming up with it at the same time as the top, but the top is getting credit for it because they're the ones actually doing it, if that makes sense. I mean, if multiple people would have thought, hey, we need counterinsurgency doctrine, but General Petraeus is in a position to actually make it happen, if that answers it. Yeah.
How do you judge the link between failure or perceived failure and impetus for innovation? In other words, the example you described were all things that weren't going well.
Right.
And they sort of reached a trough. And in that climate, people innovated and successfully got the resources they needed. But if we weren't doing something particularly poorly, we just weren't doing it very well, how hard is it to innovate from that?
I mean, it depends on the culture of the organization. Like I said, I mean, I came from a pretty successful organization, outside of that, but even in peacetime, we were constantly innovating, constantly coming up with new ways of doing things. Let me get the words right, but it was, like Crystal describes it as like, we were never seeking perfection. We were just always seeking to get better. And we never thought we were there, right? So in war and peace, we never thought we were there. So we were just striving to get better every time. So I don't think there was that. We always recognize that there's always room for improvement. So on that, I mean, so I don't know if that doesn't really answer it. I mean, one other thing I think makes this unique, that I didn't say, is I think fundamentally the time horizon was different for this than for other units that are deploying over there to Afghanistan or Iraq. When units are on like a 12-month cycle, that was their time horizon. So they aren't going to pursue innovations that are going to take more than a year to implement. Just not going to happen, right? They're going to pursue things that are going to be implementable in the next, right? They're worried about, okay, what will help me in the next 3 to 12 months. So when primarily, Task Force 714 came from a lot of the same organizations, when we deployed right after 9/11, there was the expectation we were going to, I was in Budapest on 9/11 doing an exercise, and I knew right then, this is going to be a generational fight. And my kids will probably be fighting this fight long after I'm out of the military, and that was kind of how I understood it, but I had studied CT for a while. But we looked at it of this was going to be years, decades, so we could pursue longer changes that would, innovations that might take time to fruition versus units that didn't, and so it changes. Yeah. Yep.
Granted that there will always be surprises, it's still, much of what you say still sounds like ill preparedness, rather like sending in our folks with inadequate body armor and non-armed Humvees, et cetera. I wonder to what extent you, and after all, we've been talking about counterinsurgency for back since Vietnam and even before then. So I wonder to what extent you think that it would have been possible to be better prepared by the time that these activities began.
Yeah, for this, I think for this one, this one would have been tough. The only way you can get at something like this is do interagency exercises, and they do more of those kind of things now. But yeah, like the MRAP, yeah, they should have, we knew from studying the South Americans, or South Africans back in the Rhodesian Wars, back in the 70s. They created MRAP, and we just kind of ignored it. So, I think in that case it didn't fit what our model of war. It didn't fit the model of war that we wanted. So I think we were ignoring what the actual environment was, instead wishing it to be an environment that we wanted, and being prepared for an environment that we wanted that didn't exist, or was unlikely to exist.
That's a psychological problem, isn't it?
Oh, right, yeah. It's a cultural thing. Some of that's culture, right? That's the culture, that's the kind of the cultural, bias of most of our military. Yep.
One way to think about this, and I was going to talk about this later, I'm seeing you later today, my name's Paul Pope, I'm the CI guy here, but there's a lot of ways to think about what you're saying, but the way I think about it is like this, and I was living through a lot of this stuff. When we were talking about innovation a minute ago, there's so many examples of young civilians and military people innovating during that period and taking risk to do it, personal career risk to do it. I'm going to give you one example to ground it if I could, and that is, in early 2003, you guys, black guys, were exploiting, black SF guys were having trouble exploiting. So in the station, we were sending exploited stuff back to headquarters to get help with it, and we didn't have a secure link to do it. So we decided that if we hadn't exploited already, it was unclassified, and used VSAT that we bought, and just sent it back. And somebody said, well, were you really sure? We said, well, okay, it's either exploit the stuff this way or don't exploit it, Then later we fixed that. But there were hundreds and hundreds of examples like that of exploitation that seniors saw and said, I need to hardwire that with money and do things. But the way I look at this is, this is a lot of how you did the innovation, excuse me. What was really happening was the operators learning about intelligence.
Yep.
That was really
Yep.
what was happening here. And you guys have made a complete transition, USF guys, to intel-driven operations. And what worries me going to this last question is that reset button has not been hit with big military.
Pole out there with a thing out front, and then that would be the heating device. Well, then they would, counter with something else. So that would, so yeah, it was constant back and forth on those kind of things. And here, a lot of times, yeah, they would know what some of our technical collection capabilities were, and they would try to mitigate them with that. And then it would just make it a little harder, and we'd have to find other ways. But yeah, they would change that. But fundamentally, it wouldn't change the cycle. And we knew that whatever we had was only for a short period of time, because we knew eventually they're going to learn. So we've got to exploit it as fast as possible and as much as possible until we lose that advantage. And then the whole time we're trying to figure out what it is. But you can't always jump to figure out what they're going to use next for a communication technique, because you don't know, they don't even know what it's going to be. But yeah, there is constant back and forth, constant interaction. Yep.
I know you mentioned several times teleconferences in this process, but is there another piece of technology that helps or enables this type of process?
Yeah, I mean, part of it, okay, so, coming out of like a 9/11 Commission report said, okay, right, intelligence is stovepipe. I think one of the recommendations, we need to have kind of like one repository for intelligence, right? So clearly out of Snowden and everything else, everybody always has recognized it's a bad idea and we'll never get there. So the best thing we can do besides, okay, having one repository of all this intel, right? And that's part of what the JADF is, right? So if we get analysts from all the major intelligence agencies in one room, that's as good as having a LinkedIn network. And it gives you the protection that you want within the network. So, right, so if I got an analyst from FBI and NSA or something right there, they can both tap into their home systems, right? So they're all physically located here. They're seeing it. They're all on the VTC. We've got, back home, they're attending the same VTC, but that's only in the morning, right? But this, something comes up in the middle of the day, they get that intelligence. They can just call back to home station, or they're doing it right there, digging into their computers, seeing what they have. And so that's how we would do it. So we kind of have the same operating picture. And then have we would have the discussions of, okay, what is everybody seeing? And people wouldn't always agree, but that was kind of how we would get there.
All right, well, I think we have worn out your ability to stand in front of us and listen to our questions. So let's give you a break by simply applauding you for